In my hands is a fully loaded 13-inch M4 MacBook Air. It comes with a 10-core CPU and 10-core GPU, 32 gigabytes of RAM, and a 2 terabyte SSD. And I'm going to tell you upfront that my biggest regret when buying this computer was upgrading that SSD from 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes of storage, because that was an additional $360 to go from 1 terabyte to 2 terabyte. And at those prices, those storage options are basically highway robbery on the part of Apple. Another thing is that that 2 terabyte SSD really doesn't make that much of a difference in my workflow, because all I do is I film these videos on my iPhone 16 Pro in 4K. I do the edit in Final Cut, and once everything is done, I just archive it on an external Samsung SSD. So there is practically no difference or any benefit for me, at least, in upgrading from that 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes of storage. Let's talk about pricing. Now, if I were to buy this computer upfront with no discounts applied, I would have had to pay $2,199 before tax. However, I was able to apply the education discount. And here's the thing about the education discount in the US. Apple doesn't really verify that you meet all of the requirements for that discount. And one of the things that you can say when you try to apply that education discount is the fact that you can say that you are a parent of someone who is in college. So, how is Apple really going to verify that you have a kid in college and that makes you eligible for the education discount? So that's what's going on with that, and that's how I was able to drop the price from $2,199 down to $2,019 before tax. Now, in addition to that, I was also able to apply a trade-in credit for my old M1 MacBook Air. So that M1 MacBook Air, I was able to get $434 for that trade-in value. And finally, when I did apply the tax to the final total, I spent a total of $1,726 for this fully loaded M4 MacBook Air. You may be asking yourself, why didn't I just get the M4 MacBook Pro when the pricing between this M4 MacBook Air with 2 terabytes of storage is almost identical to the M4 MacBook Pro with 1 terabyte of storage? And the biggest feature that I really love about the MacBook Air line is the fact that it doesn't have a fan and therefore does not make any noise whatsoever when you're using the computer, especially when you're pushing the CPU and the GPU cores. So because of that one fact that I lived for 4.5 years with the M1 MacBook Air without any fan whatsoever, that was the biggest draw for me to choose the M4 Air over the M4 Pro. Another thing is that if I'm honest with myself, I absolutely do not need a MacBook Pro. And the reason why is because you can see the edits in these videos are very basic. I just make talking head videos and I throw in some B-roll in the background, and that's it. And I do not need to spend the additional $300 or $400 for an M4 MacBook Pro with the same specs as this, when I'm not going to be pushing the CPU at all whatsoever. Here are some of the things I love about the M4 MacBook Air. First off is the redesigned chassis that debuted with the M2 Apple Silicon MacBook Air. Now, prior to this, Apple had been using the same design for the tapered wedge look of the MacBook Air going back to 2012. So by this point in 2020, when the M1 MacBook Air came out, that design had already been dated. And one of the great things that this new redesign brought is it reintroduced MagSafe back into the lineup. And I absolutely love MagSafe, going back to the 2013 MacBook Pro, or even before that with my standard MacBook in 2006. Ever since MagSafe came onto the scene, I absolutely love that power connector. So it was great to see that this M4 MacBook Air brought back MagSafe, and the absolute sheer thinness of this computer absolutely blows me away even to this day. Lately, I've been experimenting with some of the AI features built into Final Cut 11. And Apple redesigned the Nero engine in the M4 system on a chip to be faster compared to the M1. And I will say that when I'm using the M4 and rendering out the AI and the magnetic mask, it does feel faster compared to the M1. So lately I've been doing things such as blurring out my background, putting fancy titles behind me, or removing the color for me in the foreground using the magnetic mask. In order for any laptop to be worth its weight in salt, it has to excel in these 4 areas: battery life, keyboard, trackpad, and display. Let's talk about the display first. The panel on the M4 MacBook Air has a 60 Hz refresh, 500 nits of brightness display. When you contrast that with the M4 MacBook Pro, The display on those computers get up to 1600 nits of brightness on HDR content and up to 1000 nits of brightness on SDR content. In addition to that, you're getting a 120 Hz ProMotion display on the MacBook Pro. Now, the only time you're really going to notice the difference between the two is when you have both computers side by side. So you are going to notice that there's a lot smoother motion and that the definition and details in the ProMotion display is definitely pronounced compared to the display on the M4 MacBook Air. However, if all you're doing your work is doing exclusively done on the M4 MacBook Air, that difference in display refresh really isn't going to make that much of a difference. And I'm going to say this, even though it only has 500 nits of brightness, the display on the MacBook Air is plenty bright enough in most situations. Of course, if you're going to be in direct sunlight, worst case scenario, you are going to have a harder time seeing the display on the M4 Air compared to that of the M4 MacBook Pro. But the color definition and rendering and the motion on the 60 Hz panel looks perfectly good, and there's nothing bad that I can see about the display on the M4 MacBook Air. The keyboard and trackpad on the M4 MacBook Air are best in class. The keyboard has enough feedback and key travel to let you know when you are actually pressing down on the key. And as a result, I can type a lot faster on this keyboard compared to the keyboard on my M1 MacBook Air. Now, the trackpad, pretty much Apple has perfected. It's a glass trackpad that doesn't move at all because it has a Taptic engine underneath it, and when you press to click, it's really just vibrating the glass trackpad, but it's not moving at all. This means also that you can click anywhere on the trackpad, even in the corners, and it's going to be able to register a click because of that actuation from the trackpad and the Taptic engine. Finally, the M4 MacBook Air excels in battery life. In my experience, I was able to stream about 12 hours of YouTube before the battery hit 10% remaining. Another thing I appreciated about the M4 MacBook Air is the fact that I can run heavy applications such as Handbrake or Final Cut at full power without it being plugged into the wall. So even though that is going to dramatically shorten the battery life in your computer by doing processor intensive tasks, the fact is that you can get full power being applied to your workflow when you're not located to a wall outlet and are unable to plug directly into power. The one thing I dislike the most about this M4 Air is that there's a design flaw in the way that the screen hits the keyboard. Now, over time, the screen is going to pick up dirt and oils from the keyboard, and you're going to start seeing these little marks on the screen. And over the course of, say, 1 or 2 years, even if you do wipe off that grease every once in a while, it'll get to the point where those marks on your screen are going to become permanent. And the unfortunate thing is I don't know if Apple's going to fix that on their own, because they might say that that's either cosmetic damage or that's just due from normal wear and tear. So that's the thing that really worries me the most, is if I decide to keep this laptop for the next 5 to 7 years. Will Apple fix my screen? Because once it's there and once you start seeing it, it doesn't go away, and it's just going to bother you every time that you look at the screen. So that's just the one thing that I'm worried about the most when it comes to this M4 Air, is that design flaw. What are my recommendations when it comes to the M4 MacBook Air? Well, if you're going to start speccing out an M4 MacBook Air and the price creeps up to $2,000, I'm going to tell you to just get the M4 MacBook Pro. Because at that $2,000 threshold, you can get a MacBook Pro with 24 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage. And in addition to that, you're getting the ProMotion display that's a lot brighter. You're getting much better speakers compared to the M4 MacBook Air, and you're also getting a lot more ports. So when you put all of that together at that price point, the M4 MacBook Pro really is a good value for that amount of money. So how do I feel about the M4 MacBook Air after living with it for almost 2 months? I'm going to say that yes, I am stoked on the M4 MacBook Air, but to be honest with you, I was more stoked when I first got my M1 MacBook Air. And the reason why is because there was a generational leap coming from Intel and x86 and going over to ARM and Apple Silicon. So the fact that I was able to get so much performance in a laptop that cost me $1,440 for my M1 MacBook Air with 1 terabyte of storage and 16 gigs of RAM, and the fact that this computer was competing with and getting almost the same benchmark results as a 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro, that really put the performance into perspective. And here we are 3 or 4 generations later with the M4 MacBook Air. And it does make a difference in speed and getting your workflow done. It does make a difference, but it doesn't feel as fast coming from Intel to M1. And that's the reason in terms of performance, I really am not feeling that much of a difference between the two. And to be honest with you guys, I could have kept that M1 MacBook Air another 2 or 3 years and I would have been fine with it. It performs, it handles. But the M4 MacBook Air is what I have, and I do appreciate it, and I am stoked on it. And like I said, the only thing that throws down the level of stoked on this, the reason why I'm not so happy with it, is because of that design flaw with the screen and the fingerprints. But all in all, this is a really nice computer. As I said, I love the form factor. I love how fast it is, like when you start pushing the system. And this is a very good computer. And as I said before, I'm going to give this a rating of 8 out of 10. All right, that's about it. Peace.